On behalf of the Washington Book Prize Board, I am pleased to present to Andrew Shaughnessy a check for $50,000 and our congratulations for winning the 2014 Book Prize. Sir, I hope that's for the right cause. Congratulations. Fantastic book. Loved it. Now I want to hear what you have to say.
I said that it sounds superficially like a man bites dog story, but there is actually no better way to appreciate the achievement of the Patriots than to see this war through the eyes of the British. Now, Kurt has insisted that I admit that there are two different covers for this book. One in the United States and one in Britain. They both feature the same painting by John Singleton Copley, the American artist. It's a painting you're unlikely to have seen because this painting from the middle of the Second World War for 40 years was in Gibraltar. It was brought back to England and is now in the Guildhall Museum of Art, which is probably not the first or the primary art museum that you head for when you get to London. It's actually a life-size canvas, and if you see the lavish Yale edition, it focuses on just two figures, very appropriately the leaders. And in some ways, it almost reaffirms your traditional idea of a British officer, looking imperious, pointing in the distance, and there's a more junior officer looking up at him who looks as though he's saying, "What are you thinking?" And in the corner, there's almost a Christ-like figure on a cross being crucified. And the title has my middle name, Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy. And this is actually my mother's maiden name, Jackson, but I don't need to disappoint you because my father had studied American government as part of his degree. He'd read the Arthur Schlesinger Jr. biography of Jackson produced in the late 40s. He regarded Jackson as simply a blunt speaker on behalf of democracy and was very happy at the juxtaposition of the two names. And I might say that my parents, as part of the World War II generation, have felt eternally grateful that ironically it should be the United States which would defend British liberties. I wrote this book in an office on the Monticello estate where President Franklin Roosevelt spent 4 days leading up to D-Day, and where indeed he wrote the D-Day prayer, and he recalls a much happier moment and one that I prefer to think about in Anglo-American relations. So the US edition has my middle name, and it also has the subtitle, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of Empire. The British edition is the same painting by John Singleton Copley. It's actually called the Siege of Gibraltar, and it's not a scene from America, but it is a scene from the British during the period of the American Revolution. Needless to say, the British did not paint the American Revolution. There is no series like John Trumbull of what happened in America, because you must realize that artists only paint victories, not defeats. They omitted my middle name because they were concerned that the readers might think I was American. And the subtitle is just very subtly different. Instead of British leadership, it's British command, which has a very different tone. And instead of the fate of empire, it's the preservation of empire. And then it is indeed the same painting, but the camera has pulled back. And the man being crucified in the bottom left-hand corner has disappeared. Many more redcoats appear, looking like a rugby scrum. And instead of a scene of loss, it looks like a scene of triumph. This was, of course, a war Britain should have won. They had just fought the French and Indian War, which in Europe we know as the 7 Years' War, in which Britain had not only gained Canada and the Northwest, including Wisconsin, where I spent many happy years, but also it even had taken Havana and really Cuba in the Caribbean, as well as Guadeloupe and Martinique, and Bengal in India, which was really to be the base of Britain's future empire after the American Revolution. They went on after the American Revolution to win the French Revolutionary Wars and to defeat Napoleon. And so really the American Revolution was an aberration. And this book really attempts to explain why they failed. The most popular explanation, and this is more true in Britain even than the United States, is that it was lost by basically aristocratic buffoons and incompetent leaders. It's a view that is perpetuated in the media. I often show a clip from the Patriot. Many people think that's low. It was a film that was panned at the time, although I would argue for various reasons it could have been the great film on the American Revolution. But this stereotype of Cornwallis, more concerned with his dogs and with his sartorial elegance than winning the war, is a stereotype that you can find in all of the films. Barbara Tuchman's The March of Folly, the first third of it, is devoted to the follies of British leadership as she sees it. This was a book which was essentially about Vietnam. And finally, even college textbooks to entertain the students will often tell the same stories of the British leaders. No one in Britain is staying up at night worried about these images. In fact, as I say, they themselves perpetuated it. When the first British consul met George Washington, he was very impressed and found him imposing and charismatic. But he said, "I cannot help thinking if we'd sent better commanders, he would not look so tall." The fact is, and the whole point of this book, is that Britain did indeed send its best and its brightest. And that's why this book takes the form of 10 interlinked biographical accounts. Each subject appears rather like a play at the moment that they're crucial to the drama. And the purpose is really to show that these were people of real substance who were highly committed to winning this war. They believed that if Britain lost America, it would cease to be a major power. This is one of the longest wars in both British and in American history. It nearly bankrupted the country to fight. It did bankrupt the French government in its involvement in support of the Patriot cause. I cannot give you the background to all 10 personalities, so I'm just going to take one example. Sir William Howe, the British commander-in-chief after Bunker Hill through to 1778, and his brother, Lord Richard Howe. That immediately sounds like aristocratic nepotism, and to some extent it was, because his brother headed the Navy and the younger brother headed the army. But Sir William Howe was not just the next old boy waiting to accept command. Sir William Howe was chosen over 110 more senior generals. He was one of the most junior generals in the British Army. He'd only even got to the rank of Major General in 1772. And below him were Burgoyne and Henry Clinton. Sir William Howe was chosen because he knew America. He'd served in America, and he'd been at one of the greatest moments, the most epic moments of British history, and still regarded so today, the battle on the Plains of Abraham in which the British took Quebec. William Howe was one of the men who stood around James Wolfe and was featured in the portrait by Benjamin West. William Howe was an expert in light infantry. These were meant to be rather like modern-day commandos, troops who would be very good in unconventional warfare. It was he who insisted that his brother command the Navy. But his brother was even more distinguished. His brother was a pioneer in amphibious warfare. That's when the Army and Navy worked together. His brother may even have designed the flat-bottomed ships, but certainly introduced them, whose bows would go forward like gangplanks, and troops would just rush off. These two brothers, on a single afternoon in July of 1776, in a matter of 2 or 3 hours, got 16,500 men onto Staten Island and 40 cannon. The younger, or rather the older brother, Lord Richard Howe, went on to become one of Britain's leading naval heroes. He won a battle during the called the Glorious 1st of June during the French Revolutionary Wars. And he illustrates a theme of the book. Now, there's a very thin line between success and failure. So many of these individuals in different circumstances might have succeeded. And so the question arises, and I'm going to have to do what the advertisers call the elevator pitch version. The question arises, why did the British fail? And I see this as a war of hearts and minds. In fact, the term was actually coined by the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Henry Clinton, who said, we need to win the hearts and subdue the minds of America. It was ultimately a civilian war, and war in which civilians would be involved in a way that they were not involved in the conventional battles in Europe. Britain had an army of conquest, not an army of occupation. They occupied and captured every American city at some point during the war. But whenever they tried to take territory, as they did in New Jersey in the winter of 1776-77, as they did in Pennsylvania in 1777, and as they did in South Carolina and North Carolina in 1780 and 1781, British power imploded. They were faced with insurgencies. The South is most remarkable because they'd essentially defeated the Continental Army in the South. And yet people today who are regarded as folk heroes, Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, they managed to keep the British Army spread out, to cut supply lines, and to impede their progress north into Virginia. When Burgoyne marched south from Canada, he outnumbered the Continental Army by 2 to 1. When he got to Saratoga, he was outnumbered 4 to 1. Cornwallis met similar odds by the time that he got to Williamsburg, Virginia. The problem was that the British believed that the majority of Americans would support them. It was not incompetence, because all the best sources told them that the support was there. It is indeed very difficult to read a civilian population during wartime. Many people were neutral, whatever that means, but there was an assumption, at least, that those people could be swayed to join the British side. There were American loyalists. Like most revolutions, this was also a civil war. 19,000 Americans fought on the side of the British. This is what made it difficult for the British really to read exactly how much potential support was there. They always explained the failure to gain support by their failure to actually acquire enough territory and to maintain it for long enough. But in many ways, the British lost America before they even began fighting. They lost control of the assemblies, of the courthouses, and crucially, of the militia between the summer of 1774 through to 1776, even before Lexington and Concord. When the British were driven out of Boston, they essentially had to reconquer America. The fact that they didn't take sufficient territory meant that they had to supply the army from Britain. This created overwhelming logistical problems for an 18th century administrative system. 3,500 tons of food and fodder per day that had to come to the British Army. Bringing the army over in 1776 required the entire British merchant fleet. There were budgetary problems that Kurt mentioned earlier. Britain faced a major national debt. Every British Prime Minister was a financier because that was the main concern in Britain at the time, was the size of the national debt. We worry in the United States with a debt of 16%. The British, that it is 16% in terms of taxpayer dollars that are paid on the interest of the debt. In Britain, it was often over 50% of taxation income was just paid towards the interest on the debt. There was a fear, especially as banking and paper money were novel, that the whole system would capsize. Britain was more diplomatically isolated during the American Revolution than almost at any time in its subsequent history other than 1940. It had no allies, and after 1778, it was fighting a war with France, and in 1779, Spain, and 1780, Holland. This is why I have Gibraltar on the front cover, because this was a British victory, and this they did paint. So in many ways, the argument of the book is that conditions almost precluded success. What ultimately changed in Britain was not that they'd been utterly defeated in America, because after Yorktown, they still had their main army in New York, they still had Canada, they still had Savannah, they still had Charleston, they still had St. Augustine and East Florida. What had really changed was attitudes in Britain, and especially in the House of Commons. The opposition was getting higher and higher support until the government could no longer stay in power, and Lord North resigned in March of 1782. So in many ways, conditions precluded British success more than we might imagine. However, historians don't believe that anything is inevitable. We are always aware of contingencies and how a difference in a single battle might have changed the whole course of history. The kinds of stories that we learn in our schools about marksmen and the quality of riflemen, the role of militia, the quality of the Continental Army, these are all very much part. This was a war that America could easily have lost. And I feel, as I'm in Mount Vernon, that I cannot but pay tribute to George Washington. I always say, consider who the alternatives were to Washington. At the beginning of the war, it was John Hancock, who was something of a dilettante and did not distinguish himself in Newport, Rhode Island, in his brief period of command. There was Horatio Gates, who was perhaps the most serious contender, who indeed had won at the Battle of Saratoga, but was himself defeated at the Battle of Camden, and rode some 250 miles from the battlefield afterwards, prompting Alexander Hamilton to remark that that was quite a pace for a man of his age. And there was Charles Lee, who historians like John Shai would argue were much more radical thinkers than Washington. But Lee argued for guerrilla warfare. And what we know, even from the present Arab Spring, is that revolutions often crumble into anarchy, especially when there's no coordination, no central control, no central army. Washington recognized the importance of maintaining the civility of America. He was obsessed by it. When Lord George Germain heard about the Battle of Trenton, and Germain was the minister in England most responsible for the war and the conduct of the war from London, he dismissed it as desperate. It was desperate, but it succeeded. And if it had not done, the first chapter of my book might have been entitled George Washington rather than George III. I'll conclude this by saying that the men who lost America were not entire failures. If I ever give the talk north of the border, I'll call it the men who won Canada. These people laid the foundation for the Second British Empire. The scene that's most painted in Britain is the scene of the Battle of the Saints, fought a few months after Yorktown in April of 1782, when the British defeated the French fleet. They captured Admiral de Grasse, the admiral who'd commanded at the Chesapeake Capes and had helped make possible the blocking off of Cornwallis's army. De Grasse was captured, his flagship was taken, several of his major ships were sunk. The French were forced essentially to sue for peace. So they were not entire failures. We at Monticello and you at Mount Vernon have a joint concern about the teaching of the founding period of American history. We really have the privilege of teaching the most important civics lesson in America. It was a concern for the founders that history should be emphasized and that young citizens should understand that republics were frail and might easily fail. And you at Mount Vernon have done, I think, important work in highlighting the concern and the state of national history. But I'm going to finish with, I think, one upbeat story. And it's really a tribute to our colleagues here from Wisconsin, to Dee Dee and Tom Petri. I don't know that they realized that I lived there for many years. And this is perhaps just to show that occasionally the word is getting through to the next generation. I'd flown from Britain over through Chicago to Appleton and had taken I think it's Route 41 down to Oshkosh, and I stopped at a grocery store called Piggly Wiggly. And no one in Britain, they refuse to believe that there is such a place. And I was tired and I was jet-lagged, and I simply took the coins and notes out of my pocket and put them down on the counter. The cashier looked too young even to be bagging groceries. And I noticed to my horror as I looked down that it was all British sterling, and the coins, the notes, all had the Queen's head. And the young cashier behind the counter did not hesitate for a moment. He immediately replied, "I'm sorry, sir, we no longer accept that currency." And so I hope the book will tell you why you no longer take that currency.